Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Aisha Emadi. I'm an Education Above All youth advocate and a student at Georgetown University in Qatar studying international politics. I'll be your moderator for today's session. But before we dive into our discussion today, we'd like to hear more from you, our audience. A poll will pop up on the screen now with the question, what is the biggest barrier to education today? So let's give that a moment until it pops up. Everyone has six options to choose from. Please choose the one that you feel is most critical and you think is the most important to highlight. While we do that, I would also like to highlight a few housekeeping rules. Please use the chat to engage with us at any time throughout the session. We would like to hear from you. And there's also another tab at the bottom of your screens. It's the Q&A tab, which you can use to ask questions throughout the session, which we will be answering at the end of the session. Please do specify which panelist you would like to answer your question. I also kindly ask you to keep the questions and comments respectful to the speakers. And we have these answers. If no one has answered the poll yet, please do so now. Once again, we have two tabs. We have the chat and we have the Q&A tab. For the questions we will be answering at the end of the session, please use the Q&A tab and mention which panelist you would like to answer your questions. Now all the results are available for us all to see. I think that these results reflect exactly what we'll be exploring today, with poverty and lack of resources being the main one, armed conflict and insecurity being the second one. We have government policy and failures right after, school destruction and infrastructure, displacement and refugee status, and then gender-based discrimination. The barriers we see are real, they're layered, they have faces and names, and you're about to hear some of these stories. I'd like to continue on by saying that more than 222 million children in crisis-affected contexts need urgent education support. Behind that number are children whose schools have been bombed, whose teachers have fled, whose classrooms have become shelters for the displaced. The problem is that we are looking at this information just as we look at statistics, separating the human from the life. But these are futures that have been interrupted and lives that were taken. We all agree that education is not a privilege that can be suspended or taken away at times of conflict, but this is sadly the reality that we're living in. Education is protection, it is dignity, and yet in too many fragile contexts, it is treated as secondary, and it's treated as something we pay attention to only after the conflict ends and we plan to rebuild. On the other hand, and on a lighter note, I'm very pleased to announce that just 2 weeks ago, Education Above All was awarded the Simón Bolívar Order of Democracy Grand Cross by the Congress of the Republic of Colombia, one of the country's highest honors. This recognition reflects EAA's contribution to strengthening the protection of education from attack, supporting accountability efforts related to attacks on education, expanding access to education for vulnerable and marginalized out-of-school children, and supporting educational continuity, including in conflict-affected and displacement contexts for children most at risk of dropping out. Today, this webinar focuses on three main pillars: education, human rights, and conflict sensitivity. We will hear from those who have lived at that intersection and from institutions working to translate lived experiences into lasting policy change. Our goal today is very simple. We're here to bear witness, build understanding, and ask what it truly takes to protect the right to education in the world's most fragile places and how we can involve youth voices in this process. We will start off by introducing our first speaker, who is a member of the Joint Education Above All OHCHR Youth Advisory Board. She is an engineer, a peace builder, and an activist from Colombia with 8 years of experience in the nonprofit sector. She has also co-founded a youth-led organization called Get Up and Go Colombia that contributes to peace building by empowering communities most affected by the civil conflict, particularly youth and women. Please welcome Luisa Romero.
Hello, Aisha. Thank you so much for this invitation. I'm very excited to be here with you all.
Okay, so Luisa, would you like to expand on your introduction for us, please?
Yeah, so I am Luisa Romero. I'm from Cauca, one of the regions most affected by the Colombian armed conflict. I think growing up in this context made me, since a really young age, very aware about the context that Colombia was living through. And in 2016, a peace agreement was signed, and that was the moment that it was like a wake-up call for me to decide what to do with my future. And I decided to contribute to peace building because I have seen the impact of a conflict being so close to so many regions where young people are constantly the target of this conflict. In my personal experience, I believe that education is the most important tool to achieve this change we want to see in society. And that's why since the undergrad program, I have tried to be part of different programs. I also have applied to different scholarships, and currently I'm doing an MBA here at the University of Oxford. So this is just to show you that education can transform lives, and I'm very happy to learn more in order to give back to my society.
And Luisa, I'd like to talk about a little bit of your organization, Get Up and Go Colombia. While I was researching, I really loved the part about it focusing on storytelling. And I think it's very inspiring that it allows people to experience Colombia through local communities affected by the conflict instead of a sanitized or artificial lens for people who are visiting Colombia. Why do you think storytelling is such an important tool for peace building?
Yeah, like storytelling is so important for peace building because normally conflict often begins with dehumanization and silence. And for decades, many communities in Colombia were only spoken about the statistics, violence, or fears. And also, I feel that their voices, dreams, and dignity were somehow erased from the narrative. So I think storytelling is a powerful tool because it's the way communities and especially young people can reclaim back their identity. They can no longer seen as victims of conflict, but as a leaders, entrepreneurs, artists, guides, and peace builders. And I think that's the magic about tourism because when visitors come to these communities and hear directly from the local people, from the local young people, they begin to understand Colombia from a different perspective in a more human way. I think storytelling also creates empathy, and empathy is so essential for peace. And also, I think it becomes harder to ignore inequality or violence when you have shared a meal with someone, or when you have learned the story of someone, or you have walked through a territory and you have listened their story firsthand. So that's why tourism for me is not only about visiting places, but it's about creating these encounters that can challenge stereotypes, that can build mutual understanding, that can restore dignity to communities that were historically excluded. And in that sense, storytelling becomes like an act of memory, but also an act of transformation. So,
Mhm.
yeah, for me, tourism and storytelling are together and they do an amazing work.
Yeah. And on the other hand, another part of what you do in this complicated world is that you're a part of the Youth Rights Academy. And the Youth Rights Academy takes a very rights-based approach to education advocacy. How do you explain the concept of education as a human right to young people in your own community who are living through these crises, when survival isn't guaranteed for them?
Yes, I will explain that with a story. So part of the work that we do, we also open a peace center in Popayan, my city back home. It's a cafe that basically opens the doors to teach different areas, different subjects, and also to have English nights, workshops, and different activities. And last week, I had the opportunity to give a workshop back in Colombia. I love to teach young people about the power of scholarships and how they can access international education because for many Colombians, especially for the ones in rural areas, studying abroad feels like something very impossible to achieve. And that only happens when they start to see like older people that come from the same community that they have achieved that. So I just did that workshop. And I remember in that workshop, I met Harlison. He's a 17-year-old boy that came to speak with me after the workshop. He's from El Tambo, is one of the regions most affected by the armed conflict in Colombia, where many, many young people grow up believing that illegal economies are the only option to survive. So Harrison he told me something that literally stayed with me. He said that before the workshop, he did not really see education as an opportunity for himself because he didn't see any role models around him that had access to better educational opportunities or job opportunities. And then in his environment, survival often feels like the more urgent thing rather than dreaming about the future. But he told me that after listening to stories and after learning about the scholarships and after joining TUSPA, the Peace Center with the different workshops, he's actually learning English in a coffee shop. He like the possibilities that he now is imagining are so big. And he told me that he started to believe now in the power of education again. I think that is definitely like what pushed me forward to show young people that education can transform life. And just by seeing Harlison, like see how now he felt more motivated to continue studying and to think different about his future is like a hope. So for me, it means that to talk about education as a human right is not only about accessing to a classroom, it's about restoring hope. It's about expanding what young people believe is possible for their lives and also creating alternatives to violence and exclusion. So I just hope that with this story, like more young people can start imagine a future beyond survival where education becomes transformational. And yeah, and this the story with Harlison. Now I'm mentoring Harlison, and I hope we can see more Harlison believing in the power of education in their lives.
Yeah. And I think linking to your story, how do you think universities can better support students coming from conflict-affected areas?
Yeah, I think something very important is providing access to the opportunities, educational opportunities. One through the scholarships, 100%. I think it's very important to make visible those opportunities because sometimes there are these scholarships, but we don't know about them, and it's okay. No, you don't know what you don't know. But I think if universities make those opportunities visible, if universities can support the process of getting the admission for those universities, things can change. And the second thing that I can see is that if universities open the possibility for young people, especially from these territories, to join online programs, that's something that could also change the perspective of young people. So I think this could be to approach for universities to take a more active role in promoting the educational opportunities and inspiring young people to join the programs.
Thank you so much, Luisa. And I think continuing on from that, we are going to move to our next speaker, who is someone from Gaza, now continuing his education abroad, which links perfectly to Luisa's story. Um, Khalil, Khalil he brings a perspective from Palestine, a country that has been shaped by decades of displacement and destruction, occupation and conflict. He's a student from Gaza and now studies at an EAA supported scholar currently studying software engineering at the University of Doha for Science and Technology in Qatar. So, Khalil, as someone from Gaza, now continuing your education abroad, how has the conflict happening in Palestine that you've experienced changed your understanding of what education really means?
Yeah, so first, hello everyone. I'm Khalil Zakout. And regarding your question, as you said, I came from Gaza, so I grew up in an environment where education was seen as the main way to secure a better future for myself and for my family. So from a young age, I understood that studying and gaining knowledge could completely change someone's life. But after growing up and witnessing through multiple wars, displacement, and especially after witnessing the recent destruction in Gaza, in my home country, my understanding of education changed a little bit. I can say that I stopped seeing education as only a personal goal, which was the old idea in my mind that it's just a personal goal for me to have a better life for myself only. And I started to see education as the foundation of any strong society. Because I believe we all agree on that. If we look back at the history, we can see that every strong society that have power or authority has been built on top of knowledge. Because when everything collapses, what remains are people, their knowledge, their skills, their ability to rebuild, to solve problems, to create opportunities. All of that comes back to the people and their education. So that's, I believe, when the switch happened for me. I realized that rebuilding a destroyed country is not only about rebuilding roads or buildings, because we see always in the negotiations with the conflict zones that the first priority they put on top of the list is rebuilding the facilities, the roads and the streets, which by all means this is very, very crucial and it's very important. But also we have to focus on rebuilding an educated generation, because this generation is capable of carrying the responsibility soon after that. So I believe we should focus more on that, because I believe this goes under the radar in a lot of times. So that's why continuing education and sharing knowledge becomes something much bigger to me than just a personal success for my own life, just to have a better life.
And I completely agree with you that the youth are the ones that are going to carry this from now on.
Exactly.
And yeah, and I think that ties to our next question, which is that young activists from conflict zones, they often face a very painful tension where the world wants their pain, but they rarely make space for the power that we have as youth. So
Yeah.
how do you navigate telling your story without being reduced to a symbol of suffering? And how do you sustain your activism when the crisis in Gaza doesn't stop?
Yeah, honestly, this is something that I've personally struggled with, because many times when people first meet me, they interact with me totally normally. But once they know that I'm from Gaza, I notice the shift. And sometimes people are genuinely surprised that I have ambitions or interests in technology, or even have a personality outside of the conflict. And often they don't even realize that they are reacting to me that way, and they are not even trying to hide it. For a while, I kept asking myself, like, why this happens, because this is really hurting. If someone has ever experienced that, this is really hurting to have that idea around yourself. Until I found that there is actually a word or a term that describes that feeling, which called sunder, which is the realization that every person you pass by in your life, either in the mall, the street, or school, whatever, has a life as deep as complex as you. So everyone in the street, like we are 8 billion. Each one of those people, they have families, they have dreams, fears, memories, goals, talents, all of that. But I believe the issue is when people constantly seeing the headlines every day that 10 people dies, 200 people died, 50,000 people died. The human brain tends to numb that feeling, or start to process those lives as number, as you said, Aisha, at the beginning, that they are just stats. I think this is part of the human nature. So I understand that this is unintentionally, but I believe we should do something about that. So I think the solution is not only to share the suffer side, all the continuing to speak about the suffering and injustice is absolutely necessary, but also to create a space for people from conflict zone to be seen beyond just tragedy, in order to fix that image around them. And I believe we can do that by let them study, build careers, create, lead, speak, the thing that I'm doing right now, and show who they are as full human beings. And honestly, I'm grateful for opportunities like this one. And I know I'm a lucky person. I'm only one person among thousands of people with talent and ambition and potential, who simply need the opportunity to be heard and seen, but they don't have the opportunity. So I'm very grateful that I'm here today with all of these people taking from their precious time just to hear me speak up for those people. So if I want to leave something with people that attending today, is the idea of Sunder. Every person affected by a conflict carries a full human life behind that, just the deadlines. So they are not none. They are not just numbers. So please keep that in your mind.
I think the point that you mentioned about people not being just numbers and this lack of empathy in this world, along with the conflict that young people are going through, it's forced people in conflict zones to mature quickly. Children who were born there, who grew up there. How do you think that has shaped your own worldview?
Sorry, can you repeat the question again? I just had
So it's completely fine. Many young people in conflict zones are forced to mature quickly, partly because they were born in that conflict zone. It continued on throughout their life. How do you think for you personally that has shaped your worldview, the way you see the world, the way you experience everything that you go through?
We usually say that pressure makes diamond, and I believe this really applies to the Palestinian people. Like, I know the situation is hard and in many areas around the world, but I believe that that pressure that builds their personality, and they believe that they still have hopes in people. Because again, if like me personally, when I was in Gaza with all that uncertainty that I will not complete my studies, I lost my home, I lost everything. If someone told me that I will continue my studies here in Qatar and had the chance to speak up for those people, I wouldn't believe it. But I believe that there's always still a hope, and there's always still people in the world that are willing to give you a hand and do something. And we can see those people.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Khalil, for your
Thank you so
insights.
much. Appreciate it.
So now we're going to move to our next segment, which is an interactive segment with the audience. It is a Mentimeter or a word cloud. It should pop up on the screen soon. The link is actually in the chat if you guys could go onto that link. The question in the word cloud is, in one or two words, what does safe education mean to you? I think the best advice for everyone who has a blank in their mind right now is to just write whatever word pops up first in your mind. I think that's the priority for everyone. So once again, as a reminder, the link is in the webinar chat. So I can see protection and peace as the two main words. We have comfortable, inclusive, life change, no worries, uninterrupted, which I think is a very important one for our political and world climate right now. Development, growth, access. Possibility, motivation, safe government. I think if we look at what the audience has built together just now, these words aren't random, they're not abstract. They're things that we as a generation are demanding, and they're standards that need to be set by different organizations around the world. And this is exactly what our next two speakers are going to be speaking about. They are in charge of turning policy and reality into real life implemented situations every single day. We will start with Guerras. I would like to say before she starts, the OHCHR connects UN agencies, civil society, governments, and youth to shape the international response to education in crisis. Our next speaker is the coordinator of the Child and Youth Rights Unit at OHCHR. She is a child and youth rights expert with over 25 years of experience in human rights, having worked in OHCHR in Geneva for the treaty bodies, the special procedures mandate holders, and the Human Rights Council. Please welcome Guerras if you would like to add to your introduction.
Thank you so much, Aisha, for these words. And I wanted to add a little bit of a personal touch, which is why I ended up working in human rights. And basically, it's because the Universal Declaration for Human Rights was a very impactful document for me, particularly, and this links with what Khalil said before, particularly when it says that we are all equal in dignity and rights. This really shaped my path. And through my career, I worked at the Great Lakes, I worked in Latin America, and one other element that really shaped me as a human being and as a professional was having worked at the UN study on violence against children, because it exposed me to the reality and the cruelty of what violence does for children in particular. And I came up with this motto that I always use, which was the main conclusion of this beautiful study, which is that violence is never justified and violence can always be prevented. So from there, I'm now coordinating the Child and Youth Rights team, which is its main objective is the promotion and protection of the rights of children and young people globally.
And I'd like to further speak about your work with youth and children. Many young people are invited to join in discussions, and this is a big step that has developed over the years and over the past decade of actually including youth voices in the process, that we were excluded from for a long time. Even though the youth are referred to as future leaders, many consider themselves the change makers of now. What does meaningful youth participation look like in practice beyond the discussion rooms?
Yes, thank you. And as you say, participation cannot be limited to sitting in a room. No, there's much more to it. For us, meaningful youth participation must be grounded in human rights and in a human rights-based approach. And this basically involves recognizing young people as rights holders with agency and not passive beneficiaries. This also means moving from participation to influence, meaning meaningful participation means that inputs provided by young people must be systematically reflected in the outcomes on what we do, and that we need to provide feedback also to young people to explain how their contributions were used. Youth engagement must be integrated from the beginning in all the processes that we do, with transparency, accountability, and follow-up. And this is important because it shifts from being consulted to being recognized as equal partners and co-creators of policies and decisions. And I wanted to provide an interesting example, and it's an example of something that we did with Education Above All, which was the development of the youth empowerment system that we call YES. And this was a toolkit that was developed jointly with young people for young people, and we implemented it also at country level with youth training young people. Now that you mentioned Colombia, for example, we did a lot of training in the departments of Meta and Guavaire, and participated with many young people and schools on the trainings, and we facilitated dialogue between youth and government authorities. Also, I would like to stress that youth participation cannot be tokenistic or inaccessible, and that it really needs to make sure that we include youth from diverse ranges, not just small or already engaged groups, but we need to extend to the maximum. Finally, I would like to say also in the context of youth participation that it extends, as you said, beyond meeting rooms to whether young people can organize, express themselves, and act safely in their communities, as Luisa also mentioned at the beginning. This requires safeguarding civic space, including freedom of expression, freedom of association, and peaceful assembly, and applying do no harm approaches with protection measures and informed consent. Thank you.
And also, I'd like to ask, international frameworks like the Safe Schools Declaration, they set very important standards, but compliance and accountability are still very uneven. In your assessment, what is the single greatest systematic failure in the global protection of education and conflict today? And how would we be able to begin closing that gap?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. The greatest systematic failure from our perspective in human rights is the persistent gap between legal obligations and the reality of protection on the ground. We know we have a strong framework of international law, but the implementation, prevention, and accountability remain insufficient, allowing for violations of children's rights and education to continue. I think that in our work, where we've tried to consult children in different countries, now very, very recently, while we were preparing the High Commissioner's report on violations of child rights in armed conflict, all children consulted identify going to school or returning to school as central to their well-being and future. So basically, I would like to transmit the message that the problem is not the lack of standards, but the failure to apply them. And how does this look for children? We know attacks on education are increasing, schools are damaged, destroyed, or used for military purposes. And these conflict conditions lead to violations of child rights for children, including child labor, exploitation, child marriage, which all of them further block the right to education. So it's correct violations are both produced through direct attacks, but also because those attacks lead to further violations. Now, what is needed to close the gap, and this gap that we see first to translate law into practice and implement concrete legislative, administrative, and operational measures, I think it's very important to try to prevent violations before occur. Protect schools from attack and military use. Protect. Ensure accountability and impunity as well, and conduct prompt and independent investigations, and provide as well remedies for children. Guarantee the continuity of education. As I said, for children is very important, even in times of conflict, that we maintain education. It's a protective element. So maintain this education during conflict and provide alternative and catch-up learning opportunities. And finally, I would say that what can help us close the gap is also to support recovery and reintegration and invest in trauma-informed and long-term support, and recognize that education as a central to psychosocial recovery and integration for children. Thank you.
Ima, I'd like to ask you one more question linking to the psychological aspect of the effects that young people and children go through in conflict zones. What do you think, aside from education being a fundamental part of their well-being, impacts the psychology of these young people that institutions are still unable to grasp or to use in their policy implementation?
Thanks for this question. It's very interesting. When we speak to children, we always realize that if the child has a protective environment or a nurturing environment, the future for the child is better. And this can include, for example, the families, or because sometimes in conflict, children go through very serious situations where the families are lost. And in the case where we wouldn't have a family, we have also noted that the presence of a trusted adult or a trusted community can support the children go through in addition to education.
Thank you so much, Ima. Our next speaker is an international lawyer and currently the Law and Policy Manager in Education Above All's Protect Education and Insecurity and Conflict program. He leads on strengthening law and policy frameworks for accountability for attacks on education, currently focusing on Colombia, Yemen, Ukraine, Nigeria, and Sudan. Please welcome Siraj Khan, if you would like to expand on your introduction.
Thank you very much, Aisha. I'm very happy to be here and to be joined with such wonderful colleagues and participants. As Aisha mentioned, I'm a lawyer by training. Originally I'm from Pakistan. I was born in Pakistan, and actually my parents moved to the UK for the very reason that they wanted me to be educated, to a high level. And I'm very grateful for that. But as I've grown older and as I've gone through my own educational and career path, what I've noticed is that there is a huge need for people from conflict backgrounds and countries in which education is really it's challenging as a right. It's very difficult to access as a right, to actually check their privilege to a degree and try to address the issues that they themselves have faced or they could have faced, and to use their positions and their positions in work and in society to try to not only help but try to give access and opportunities to those who weren't able to have the same opportunities that they've been afforded. So I'm very happy to be here, and I'm delighted also to be participating in this very important seminar, and I'm really enjoying some of the points that have been mentioned by our previous speakers. And it's that I don't think there's a replacement for you could call it storytelling, but I think it's the human story, right? It's a story of people who have actually experienced things that we need to be listening to more to be able to then do the work that we try to do. Without that, it's, what we do is purely theory. So thank you very much for inviting me.
And along with that theory, we hear time and time again of the promises of the theories from world leaders to protect education from attack. But then we turn on the news and still see reports about children, teachers, and shelters being attacked. From your perspective, where is the gap between international promises and actual implementation, and how can we solve that?
Yeah, Aisha, this is a question I ask myself every day.
Yeah.
Let me try and answer it as honestly as possible. Look, the world has made lots of promises, and countries have made lots of promises, world leaders as well. There's over 123 countries that have signed what we call the Safe Schools Declaration, which is a political commitment. Let's bear that in mind. It's a political commitment to protect schools, teachers, and children during conflicts. The UN has also passed resolutions. World leaders have given speeches, but yet, if we look at the most recent period in 2025 alone, over 11,000 students in Colombia, students and teachers, have been affected by attacks on education. And that's just in the parts of the country where we have data, right? There are other areas in the country where we don't have the data. So the number is likely higher. In Palestine, as Khalil mentioned, over 650,000 children have been affected by attacks on the complete obliteration of education, in fact, particularly in Gaza. So why do we have this gap? I mean, I could answer it very simply by saying that, look, we're being made promises without any actual action behind them, without actually fulfilling those promises. And it's not as if these promises or the people making these promises don't have the resources. There are resources. They need to be allocated, and they need to be put into action in places where we have at least the data. So, for example, when armed groups attack a school or kill a teacher, the question that should follow is, who is responsible for these things, right? And under the international legal system that we have, the state is primarily responsible for providing the right to education, even in times of conflict. And in fact, in times of conflict, both the state and the armed actors both have an obligation to ensure that, irrespective of the armed conflict, the right to health and to education is protected, even in an armed conflict. And that's something that we can't forget. This is in international law. But the question is, which law applies and which court enforces these rules? And as we know, in most conflict-affected countries, there is no clear answer, because the institutions that are supposed to be protecting these rights are often defunct or absent because of the conflict. And so what we see is that the attacks continue and there's no consequences. And so at the department in which I work, at Education Above All, the Protect Education in Insecurity and Conflict program, we're trying to fix this issue, right? This is one very particular issue that we're trying to deal with. And our job is to take those international promises and turn them into real legal consequences and policy consequences. And so, into real legal frameworks, into actual laws, actual policies, and actual decisions that have real consequences. And so in Colombia, for example, we've been working with national partners and the Colombian Congress also on a draft law, which you mentioned in your introduction, that will specifically criminalize attacks on education. And coming back to the point that Khalil and Luisa have both talked about listening to the people on the ground, this is exactly what the partners in Colombia have done. They've listened and they've seen that there are two main types of attacks on education in Colombia. One is what they call docenticide. Sometimes it's also referred to as scholasticide, which means the targeted killing or the forced silencing of teachers as a deliberate strategy of war. Because armed groups know that if you remove the teacher, then you don't just stop education, you break the community, right? So this is something that they use. And the second is something called forced deschooling. So where children can't go to school, not because the school is destroyed, but because armed groups have made it too dangerous, because they will recruit children from the schools into the armed movements. So while the school is still there, it's more of a danger than a place of safety, as we saw in the Menti word diagram, that safety and protection is one of the biggest concerns. And so until we name these things in law, however boring it may be, however, high level it may be, until we actually give these a legal framework, it's almost impossible to deal with the consequences. And until we then prosecute those crimes, they will keep happening. And that is the gap between the promise and the reality on the ground, which we call impunity, right? That there's no consequences for actions. And closing that gap is, I think, our work.
And other than the examples that you've already mentioned about Colombia, what practical law and policy interventions have really led to protecting education in situations of conflict and insecurity?
Yeah, unfortunately, there are very few. There have been at the International Criminal Court, there have been some prosecutions, not specifically for the crimes of attacking education, but for war crimes in general, and where attacking education or recruiting children into armed movements was part of the list of indictments of the criminal offenses that were committed. But it wasn't, identifying just education as a crime, unfortunately. But that's where I think Colombia really is at the forefront in terms of, if you want to call it legal technology or legal developments. And when we started our work on law and policy there, the instinct that we had as lawyers was, yes, let's open the legal textbooks, let's look at the laws, let's look at the legal framework, let's look at what international law says. And what we found was actually that the violence that was being done to education in Colombia was real. It was documented. It was, devastating in terms of its effects, but it didn't fit clearly into any legal categories. And that's why there was very little in terms of consequences, right? And so teachers were being killed, not by accident, but it was a strategy, as I said. And children weren't just being caught in the crossfire, they were being recruited, they were being actually targeted, right? Sometimes by people standing around the school gates. And so families were being told that, if your child goes to school, something's going to happen to them. And so it matters that this was falling outside of the legal framework. So what we had to do was we had to adapt. Instead of just applying the existing law, which is the normal recourse, we had to help and discuss with our partners in Colombia how to create new legal language to capture what was happening on the ground, right? It was not enough, if someone goes and attacks a school, they would probably be prosecuted for criminal damage of a building, property damage, right? But that's not what's going on. There is something much bigger going on. And so we had to ensure that that was being covered by the legal language. And again, in Colombia, it was not that, Colombia was ahead of the pack in the sense that they also created, as part of the peace agreement in 2016, they created something called the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. And this isn't a standard criminal court. It is a transitional justice mechanism. And that completely changes how we think about accountability. It's not just about punishment. It's now about truth, what happened. It's about reparation, what damage was done, and how can we change that into a better situation. Sometimes it's called restorative justice, right? Rather than punitive justice. And so this actually gave life to the peace agreement in terms of how we can protect education. So we worked with that institution, and we worked with the Congress as well. And the result is that we have now, for the first time in the world, a draft law in front of Parliament in Colombia, which specifically criminalizes attacks on education, the specific types that Colombia was facing. And I think the lesson that I at least take from this is that, conflict-sensitive work means that we need to listen before we legislate. We need to listen before we make laws. Laws can be made in any part of the world, and they'll look very good, and it will be very, it will be perfect legal language. But until it matches the reality on the ground, it is, not worth the paper that it's written on. And so the communities that live through these attacks often understand the problem better than any framework that we could design from the outside without listening to them. And so our job is really to translate what they experience into laws that then protect them and deal with the situation on the ground.
Yes. Thank you so much, Siraj. I think it's very important to shed a light on the legal aspect of all of these conflicts and their links to education. Thank you to all of our panelists. We now open the floor for questions from the audience. So please submit your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. I will be asking my first question for Luisa. Based on your youth work in Colombia, what are the best ways to keep youth engaged?
Hello, thank you, Aisha. Yes, I already typed the answer, but yeah, I basically shared that there are like some best lessons that I can think is like making your participation real and meaningful. So it doesn't mean just having young people because of having them, but including them in the activities that you're doing, and also creating opportunities through education, leadership, entrepreneurship. So something that we did some time ago was to create like a boot camp for young people from these former war territories. And then the training that we did was like audio recordings that they were shared through WhatsApp groups. And it was so beautiful because I know that in some of these areas it's really difficult to access internet connection, but at least it's easier to get data and to access WhatsApp. So it's about finding the different mechanisms about how you can reach out to these people, to these communities, to these young people, and then bringing the education that they need. Also, I think it's very important to build safe spaces where young people feel heard and valued. I think sometimes it's really hard for young people to open themselves and to share like their stories that they have, as it was my case with Harlison last week. But I think when they feel that they're in a safe space, they will be more open to share what they're going through, and in that way you can engage and connect. And also the use of storytelling, as we discussed at the beginning of this webinar, the local role models to inspire hope and agency as well. Like I think sometimes when you don't see someone that comes from your community that has done something different, it's very easy to stay in the same comfort zone, say, oh, no one is doing nothing, so why I'm going to be the different one. But then if you see a role model, it's like, oh wow, that person comes from the same community than me. That person has done exactly the same thing, so it means that there is hope that I can do something different too. So I inspire everybody here to be role models in your community and to inspire hope. And then the last is just to support youth consistently with long-term community engagement. I think there are like small actions that we all can do, like mentoring sessions, even like online workshops, like things that can really provide an opportunity for young people to believe that there is hope and that there is something that we can create for a better reality.
Yeah, thank you so much,
Thank
Luisa.
you.
Ima, I have a question for you. For any young person watching this now who would like to influence global frameworks and not just advocate from a distance, but actually step into the rooms, what's the first thing that they can do?
Thank you, Aisha. To be able to influence global frameworks, you have to be able to participate in the discussions. There are different possibilities of getting involved. I would like to mention one that we will be launching very soon, which is the Global Alliance on Human Rights, which is an initiative of the High Commissioner. And there will be a youth advisory group that will be formed to influence policy and human rights decisions. This is still not done, but it will be done on the making. The High Commissioner will announce this global alliance at the beginning of June. So I actually suggest young people here to pay attention to that call that we will be making at the beginning of June as a very specific example. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I have a question for Khalil next. Khalil, for you as a person from Gaza, of course, you know other people from Gaza who are working to advocate for themselves to make the world understand that Palestinians are not just statistics or numbers, as we mentioned at the start, but it does get demotivating when you see the reality. What is your message for your fellow advocates, to keep them going and keep them feeling hopeful in this, I don't know how to call it, ideological war that we're living?
Yeah. Unfortunately, the only thing that we all can do as Palestinians is just keep trying, and hopefully one day our efforts will be fruitful. And as long as there are amazing people out there in the world willing to put the effort to help you, I believe one day you will get it. And I can see that, for example, Miss Lucia and Miss Ima, they are putting their entire life towards a message. So I believe their efforts will go somehow to those Palestinians and even other parts of the world. So just keep trying, and hopefully, inshallah, you will get an opportunity one day.
Inshallah. And for Siraj, I think you spoke about this when you talked about bringing more conflict-affected people into the conversation. How do you think institutions can become more conflict sensitive in the way that they design educational programs or education protection programs?
Yeah, it's a very difficult one because institutions tend to be very closed, right? And access to them tends to be very limited. I think one of the things that we're trying to do is also use the examples that work, and the people who do the work where it works. For example, the people that we've been working with in Colombia, we're trying to ensure that they also have access to those same rooms where we can actually present their models and say, look, this is how they did it here. Of course, you can't transplant one thing from one context to another. Every context will have its peculiarities, but there are some things that can be learned from. And so this lessons learning phase has to take place. And we really need to show where things can work on the ground. We need to make enough noise about them to be able to say, look, this has worked. This is something that we can show as a working model. And we're, at least at Education Above All, we're very keen to ensure that we try to open up those rooms for youth, for advocates who historically, for whatever reasons, don't have access to those rooms. And one of the questioners has also asked about anti-colonial and culturally appropriate approaches. This is how we have to do it. Unfortunately, those rooms that are closed for very, very obvious reasons, right? They don't want to hear from people who break the mold. They don't want to hear from communities that don't fit their idea of what works and what doesn't work. But what we've seen in recent years is that actually the system hasn't been working perfectly. There are cracks, and those cracks are becoming bigger. And we actually have models on the ground which do work really well. And it's time that those models get publicity, they get visibility in those rooms to show that, look, there is actually a model that works, and we can try to strengthen those models and apply them in other contexts.
Yes, thank you so much, Siraj. And I'd like to ask a question aimed at all of our speakers, but I'd also kindly ask you to keep the answers brief. What gives you guys hope when working in spaces shaped by conflict? We'll start with Luisa and then hear from Khalil, Ima, and Siraj.
Aisha, can you please repeat the question? I couldn't
Yes,
hear the
of
last
course.
sentence.
What gives you hope when working in spaces that are shaped by conflict?
Oh, I think that what brings me hope is to think that it's gonna be super difficult to create a different reality, but the power and the energy of the young people that want to change is what gives me hope. And also, I just wanted to share in the chat the Yes platform, is the youth empower system that Ima just shared. I think that's something that we worked during the last year, and it's an incredible platform that will allow you to learn about the advocacy, it's like a toolkit so you can learn step by step, and it's also available in different languages. So I hope that this information that you find here can give you hope, and hopefully it can inspire more young people to take action.
Khalil, what about you?
Yeah, so for me, I was thinking about seeing people still choosing to continue. I believe that's hope. When I see students are still trying to study no matter what the resources that they have, when I see parents still sacrifice for their children's future, when I see young people still try to help their communities, for me, hope is not something abstract. So I see it every time when someone in a difficult situation still decides that their future is worth investing in, even if just imagining that, I believe that's hope.
Thank you so much. And Ima?
You know what gives me hope? It's the resilience that children has and that they demonstrate through playing. The right to play is a fantastic right because it restores, it nourishes, and it heals as well, like the right to education. But playing, it's something that it's happens everywhere, even in conflict, and it gives me the hope that the children can continue despite the circumstances.
Thank you so much, Ima. That's a very beautiful message. Siraj?
Yeah, I think for me it's similar, but it's the courage that people like Luisa and Khalil and other people in similar circumstances have shown. It's not easy to go up against the status quo, and it's very easy to sit back and say, well, I can't do anything. And it's actually it's people like Khalil and Luisa who give us more strength to do the kind of work that we do and more reason to do it. But we don't do it alone. We need them to do it with us. And the people that we've been meeting in the countries in which we work, I mean, it's amazing courage. People who have lost family members, people who have lost their livelihoods, and yet still for them, when you ask them what the most important thing is, they say it's the right to learn safely and the right to actually fulfill what we call fulfilling human potential, of which education is a core part.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Siraj. And thank you so much to our panelists. I think we all came into this webinar carrying our voices and our messages that we wanted to be heard. And we left with names, stories, and examples that refuse to be silenced. To our youth speakers, Luisa and Khalil, thank you so much, not just for your presence here and for engaging in this conversation, but for your strength and your endurance and your motivation to continue going on. And to Siraj and Ima, thank you so much for engaging with us as well and letting us know how institutions and how lawmakers are working towards fixing what has been broken. And to everyone watching, thank you so much. Your presence has been greatly appreciated, and it's a statement to all that youth are here and we're here to stay and we're here to speak and advocate for ourselves. Lastly, I would like to say, please follow EAA's social media channels to stay connected with the events we're planning on and any opportunities that youth have to engage with us. And remember that education is not a right, it's not a reward, it's not a luxury, it's not something that should wait for peace. It's something that people need to have. It's how we build peace. And on behalf of the Education Above All Foundation, thank you all and see you again in our next Education Above All webinar. Thank you so much.